Good afternoon. Welcome to This Week in Turkey. A court issued an arrest warrant for the famous Turkish actor Mehmet Ali Alabora for charges of attempting to overthrow the government by taking part in the organization of the 2013 Gezi Park protests.
Istanbul Chief Public Prosecutor's Office says they want to arrest Alabora for provocative social media posts and for his active role during the Gezi Park demonstrations. Alabora is currently abroad, and he's also being accused of collaborating with prominent philanthropist Osman Kavala, who has been behind bars without an indictment since November 2017. The prosecutor now claims that the domestic organization of Gezi Park protests was made by Osman Kavala, while the international connections of the protests were undertaken by the institutions associated with George Soros. 2 days before the arrest warrant being issued, President Erdogan had also named Kavala and Soros as organizers of the protests. As part of the investigation that has been launched into Gezi Park protests, an operation was carried out against civil society workers and academics on November 16, 2018. While 12 of the 13 detained were released afterwards, Yiğit Aksakoğlu, the Turkey representative to the Netherlands-based Bernard van Leer Foundation, was arrested.
The International Press Institute, a global network of editors, media executives, and leading journalists for press freedom, announced on Thursday the ending of a high-level press freedom mission to Turkey.
Led by IPI Executive Board Chair Marcus Spillman, the mission will meet the representatives of the Turkish government, foreign diplomats, journalists, and members of civil society over the course of 3 days in Ankara and Istanbul. According to the IPI's Free Turkey Journalist campaign, there are over 160 journalists in jail. Yet, the Turkish government has repeatedly argued that the journalists are jailed due to their non-journalistic activities. In an interview with BBC, Turkish Defense Minister Hulusi Akar stated that prisoners are in jail within the scope of the files prepared for their closed-door activities. None of them are in jail for their journalistic activities. However, according to the IPI, the jailed journalists are subject to flawed judicial proceedings and denied basic rights of defendants under the European Convention of Human Rights, including, in some cases, the right to defend oneself in courts. Along with the high number of jailed journalists, another concern for the Turkish press freedom is the increasing monopoly in the media and the increasing number of closed media outlets over the last 2 years. According to the IPI, approximately 90% of the national media is under government influence. Meanwhile, nearly 180 media outlets have been forcibly closed. According to the 2017 World Press Freedom Index of the Reporters Without Borders, RSF has seen Turkey fall to the rank of 157 among 180 countries. The index ranking marked Turkey's 58-point decrease over the past 13 years, lagging just behind Rwanda, Belarus, and the Democratic Republic of Congo.
Joining us now is Ms. Barbara Trianfi, the Executive Director of the International Press Institute. Ms. Trianfi, welcome to the studio.
Thank you very much.
Ms. Trianfi, the IPI conducted a mission, a high-level mission in Turkey in terms of press freedom. I want to talk about the mission, but before going into that, during the past several years, and particularly over the last year, the press freedom in Turkey is reported to have deteriorated in Turkey. And you as an individual and as an institution like IPI have been focusing on Turkey very much. What are your observations? What have you monitored so far?
Thank you very much for having me and for allowing to present the results of what have been 3 very interesting days that we spent in Turkey, but also the results of our constant monitoring of press freedom developments in Turkey. IPI is a global network of journalists and editors. Our members come from all over the world, and we have been working in Turkey for many years in cooperation with our members here, but also as part of a global community that is very interested and in ensuring that their colleagues in Turkey can operate freely and without fear of repercussion. IPI's concern, if you want, about a degenerating situation, press freedom situation in Turkey started longer than a year ago. They started probably almost a decade ago, when we started seeing the first signs of some media outlets moving, changing ownership. Certain journalists were reporting to us being under pressure, and certainly this level of pressure and this level of restrictions on journalists' ability to report the news, report what is going on in the country freely has been growing until the time after the failed coup of July 2016, when IPI saw a sudden imprisonment of many journalists, hundreds, criminal charges being pressed against people just because, in connection with their writings, with their reporting, with journalistic content, and following that also shutting down numerous media outlets up to, according to the data available to IPI, nearly 170 news organizations have been shut down following the failed coup of July 2016. And today, IPI counts 162 journalists currently sitting in prison, and certainly many more facing criminal charges.
You've been in contact with many journalists, and you've been following the developments. You're describing a general environment in Turkey. Is this affecting self-censorship as well?
Certainly, certainly. Additionally to the situations I just described, many news have been taken over by people who are more or less close to the government. The outcome of that is that the news coverage cannot be critical of the government and the government actions as it used to be. And this has resulted, indeed, on one hand, to many journalists losing their jobs as a consequence of the closure of the newspapers, but also of the consequence of the fact that those news organizations that were taken over by owners who are closer to the government line do not accept certain more critical voices. And many journalists, in order to continue operating, have to resort to self-censorship, limiting their ability to cover facts here. And that is what I consider one of the biggest problems that Turkey is facing today. The level of loss of independent information is constantly growing because of the continuous political pressure journalists are under. Additionally to that, of course, you add an economic situation in the country that does not favor the flourishing of media organizations, and that make it very difficult for media organizations, all of them, in particular those who are more independent, to survive. And this leads to additional concerns about the content and additional self-censorship.
You described the rapid changing in ownership of the media outlets. On one hand, as you said, you described self-censorship in terms of the changing ownership. But has this changing ownership also changed the general environment in terms of press freedom in Turkey as well?
According to the information that was reported to the International Press Institute from many different sources, being observer, local observer, international observer, journalists, and really people who deal with the media situation in Turkey on a daily basis, today it is widely believed that 95% of the news environment is, in a way or another, under the direct control of the government. This is done, as I said, on one hand, by creating a climate of fear through the criminal charges, through the imprisonment, and through the shutting down of newspapers, but on the other hand, also through the takeover of ownership. So absolutely, this has had terrible effects on the ability of the of people in Turkish to have access to a diverse spectrum of ideas, of opinions, and of information.
IPI as an institution has been campaigning for press freedom, not only in Turkey, but in Turkey as well. Where does IPI stand? What's the aim? What's the target? What's your results, the ultimate result of the mission?
In Turkey?
Yes, please.
In Turkey, this mission, IPI has been carrying out a regular mission to Turkey for many years. And the goal of a mission like the one we have just carried out is, on one hand, to try, to the extent that is allowed to us, and to the extent that the authorities in Turkey are willing to do this, to try to keep up a dialogue with whoever is in charge of institutions that influence the media and that influence the ability of journalists to operate freely here. So we want to have that dialogue because we believe that it's only through that dialogue that we can present what are our observations on the basis maybe of international standards, on the basis of what have been the rulings of the European Court of Human Rights, and all of that, and in which area we feel that Turkey is not in line with those standards. On the other hand, of course, a mission like this is also to be to show solidarity and to show support to those many people, individuals, journalists who continue to struggle in this country to deliver information that is independent to their audiences. And we believe that, on one hand, showing solidarity delivered through, on behalf of IPI's global membership, of the editors that we do represent, and that very often contact us, our headquarters in Vienna, to make sure, to ask, to express concern about what is going on with their colleagues in Turkey. So there is that level of solidarity, but also in order to understand together with them what is it that an organization like IPI can do to help them in their effort to deliver quality journalism, independent information, which is the core aspect of IPI. IPI is an organization dedicated on one hand, certainly to press freedom, but primarily to quality, independent, public interest journalism. So this is the ultimate goal.
And meanwhile, there are arguments, debates in terms of whether this situation in Turkey is being normalized by the world. How do you see this? You spent time in many different countries, and you observe Turkey both from the outside, and you can come for missions in Turkey as well. But is the world getting used to the situation in Turkey?
It's interesting, the word normalized, how it's used. We heard the word normalization many times throughout the past 2 days from representatives of government institutions, of ministries. And this was part of assurance that we receive by representative of Justice Minister, the Foreign Minister, and so on, that the situation following the lifting of the state of emergency, the situation will go back to normal in the sense of will go back to a situation in which media freedom is allowed in the country. So in that sense, we have also told the people that, those representatives that have made this statement, that we do not see any sign of this happening in Turkey, rather the opposite. We feel that the situation is, if possible, becoming even worse. So on that sense, there is the hope for a normalization in the sense of going back to a situation where journalists can operate freely, independently, normally. On the other hand, I think there is the concerns about normalization in the sense, is this situation in Turkey becoming the status quo? Is this the situation that is here to stay? And that is the biggest concern that we see in that we have certainly monitored. And to give you an example, a lot of those that were passed as emergency decrees have now become law. So those that were born as decrees, as something in a situation of emergency, has now become piece of legislation that is here to stay, and most of these pieces of legislation are heavily restricted on media freedom. So this is becoming the standard in Turkey. And finally, there is another term of the normalization. Yes, and this is what you referred to, I think, and is the current situation now being perceived as normal from outside of Turkey? Mm-hmm. Yes, there is also that concern. At the end of 2016, when the arrests of the journalists happened, when the criminal charges were pressed and all of that, the world was under shock, looking at what was going on in a country that up until not many months before we felt was a very democratic country, or certainly a country with strong democratic institutions. So we felt it was shocking that was going on. And now you know very well the circle of news. You cannot keep something in the news for long enough, even if that situation is still shocking today. But how many times are our audiences willing to talk about it? So that is the biggest concern, and that is something that IPI is trying to counter by showing that new things are happening, which are even worse, if you want, and that anyway also showing the level of difficulty that journalists have here in operating on a daily basis.
And is this changing perception of perhaps the Western world affecting the solidarity for Turkey in a negative way, perhaps?
I don't think so. I think it depends. I think it depends whom you're looking at. Within the IPI community of members, we work, and IPI includes journalist editors who are highly dedicated to press freedom, and certainly they are very much aware that their colleagues in Turkey need a lot of support, need solidarity, and are willing to stand up for them. In other circles, I think that we need to, it's possible that it is happening as part of the normalization of the current situation that we were talking about before. So is the solidarity diminishing? As I said, I think within the profession not. Possibly outside of the profession, possibly it may be part of that normalization process that IPI is, however, fighting against. This said, IPI organizes numerous events around Europe to talk about the press freedom, the media situation in Turkey today, and the level of pressure, as I said, economic and political pressure journalists are under in Turkey today. And these events still attract a lot of attention, a lot of audience, a lot of coverage. So I think that there is still a great level of concern. And we are fighting to keep it up.
Ms. Barbara Trianfi, thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
The Justice and Development Party, AKP chairman, and President Recep Tayyip Erdogan named 14 more mayoral candidates for the upcoming March 31st local elections. The candidate for Istanbul, however, is yet to be decided.
Erdogan nominated Necdet Takva, head of the Chamber of Industry and Commerce for the Eastern Province of Van, for Metropolitan Mayor. Other candidates are as follows. For the city of Ağrı, Savcı Sayan, Aksaray, Enver Dinçer, Bilecik, Nihat Can, Erzincan, Cemalettin Başsoy, Edirne, Koray Uymaz, Iğdır, Adil Asırım, Isparta, Şükrü Başdeğirmen, Kars, Ensar Erdoğdu, Kırşehir, Yaşar Bahçeci, Kütahya, Ahmet Sami Kutlu, Siirt, Ali İlbaş, Tunceli, Gökhan Arslan, and Zonguldak, Ömer Selim Alan. With the 60 previously announced mayoral candidates, including candidates for Ankara, Izmir, and 12 more metropolitan municipalities, to date, the ruling AK Party has announced 74 provincial mayoral candidates. Meanwhile, Ahmet Türk, a veteran Kurdish politician, announced on Wednesday that he was to run for the mayor of his native province of Mardin once again, a post the Turkish government dismissed him from over 2 years ago at the beginning of the crackdown with terror-related charges.
According to data released by the Turkish Statistical Institute, the annual inflation rate fell by 3.62% in October.
The Consumer Price Index in Turkey has seen a 21.62% annual hike in November. The annual inflation fell by 3.62 percentage points from 25.24% in October, according to the Turkish Statistical Institute, TÜİK. The highest price increase on a yearly basis was seen in furnishing and household equipment with 32.73% in November, miscellaneous goods and services with 27.87%, food and non-alcoholic beverages with 25.66%, housing with 24.76%, and recreation and culture with 21.18% were the other main groups where high annual increases realized, said in Institute's statement on Monday. Turkish Treasury and Finance Minister Berat Albayrak said, inflation figures have proved the success of the anti-inflation policy of the government put into action after annual inflation rate reached 24.5% in September, up from 17.9% in August. The rebalancing process has shown its effects on the inflation figures as it did on the exchange rates and interest rates, he said on his Twitter account on Monday. We have been supporting the period of removing the price bubble by our strong stance in monetary and fiscal policies, he added. The economic program, announced by Albayrak on September 20th, forecasts that inflation would rise to 20.8% this year, before dropping to 15.9% in 2019 and 9.8% in 2020.
That's all from This Week in Turkey. Thanks for tuning in, and hope to see you again next Friday. Goodbye.